what the ancient Greek Plutarch said concerning the moon, whether it can be inhabited, the role in creation, and the descent of souls. One of the not-so-well-known works of Plutarch is about the appearing face of the circle of the moon, hence the free translation, about the face that appears in the sphere of the moon. Although the text written in the form of a dialogue is not preserved in its entirety today, it's one of the oldest works that gathers interpretations and opinions about the moon as they were perceived through observations by modern researchers of Plutarch's time. About the appearing face of the circle of the moon has been included by philologists in a wider body of works called Ethics, a collection of many treatises and speeches recorded by Plutarch covering a wide variety of topics. Thus, this treatise, in the form of a dialogue, significantly influenced, as the astronomer Kepler later found out, those who read Plutarch's work on the moon are not surprised if they bring to mind the works of Lucian with a corresponding theme, true history, and Menopus or Hypernephelus. There are modern studies by historians and philologists who argue quite convincingly that Lucian, if not directly influenced, seems to have read or had in mind the specific work of Plutarch, although he does not mention his name in any of his works. For the record, it should be mentioned that astronomers have named the ancient Greek author Plutarch after one of the craters of the moon, thus referring to his specific work. Quote, all around it shines with fire, bluer than blue stone. It looks like a daughter's eye, and her wet forehead looking at her looks like a face, end quote. Poem of the poet Aiasynaktas for the face of the moon was mentioned in about the appearance of the face of the circle of the moon. A few words about the project and the faces of the dialogue. About the appearing face of the moon, or in short, about the face of the moon as a multifaceted dialogue between people on astronomy, cosmology, geography, and optics. An important part of the dialogue that we will talk about in more detail is the myth of the role of the moon in the life cycle of souls, an issue in which the role of the moon seems to be crucial for humans in antiquity, but has been mentioned in previous articles by Jonas Mangos, quote, who steals souls from the moon, end quote. The face or phases of the moon in all cosmologies of the ancient world were considered from the most benevolent to the most frightening thing that the soul could face in its attempt to free itself from the world of matter. As can be seen from the dialogue that has survived, his introductory chapters have obviously been lost, so we don't know what was the reason for this discussion, when it happened, and where. However, the participants seem to represent the philosophical current of the author's time and appears in the following order. 1. Sulla is a Carthaginian who is very willing to tell a myth or story about the moon from a friend he heard in Carthage. This story is actually told by Sulla at the end of the play, giving information about the worship of Saturn in Carthage and how it's related to nature and the position of the moon on the planet. 2. Lamprias, he is probably the older brother of Plutarch. 3. Apollonides, astronomer and geometer. 4. Aristotle, it's possible that Plutarch named him so to denote a representative of Aristotle's walking school. 5. Pharnaces, a Stoic philosopher. 6. Lucius, student of the philosophy of Pythagoras from Etruria. 7. Theon, grammarian from Egypt. 8. Menelaus, the prominent astronomer who lived and worked in Alexandria, where many of his observations were recorded by Ptolemy and other writers. Perhaps one of the reasons that this work of Plutarch has not been studied in depth is due to the difficulty presented by the scientific astronomical details as recorded in the text, while that part that mentions the myth about the role of the moon in the journey of the souls seems to have occupied the scholars of philosophy, but again, not systematically. In fact, the text seems to be divided into 3 parts that are quite different from each other, at least the last two from the first. Let's take a closer look at each part. The scientific part. In the first part, we meet the central topic of discussion that concerns the modern philosophical scientific theories about the moon from the time of Plutarch. This section presents a wide range of views based on the physics, astronomy, and geometry of the time that were used as tools to determine the components and materials that shape the moon. Perhaps this piece is one of the only ones in antiquity that brings together, in the best way, all the scientific truths of the time about the Earth satellite, the moon. This section summarizes the theories, such as those of Aristarchus and Hipparchus, disputes the laws of reflection, rejects the theory of physical motion towards the center of the universe, and discerns the first foundations for the future theories of Copernicus and Galileo, and Kepler. In fact, the latter argued that this dialogue of Plutarch was the most important work of antiquity on the subject of Earth's satellite. Kepler, from an early age, had shown great interest in the moon and translated Plutarch's text from Greek, which was originally written in Latin, supplementing his own remarks where he considered them necessary. The prevailing view in the section is contrast to the Stoics and Aristotle, who argue that the moon is a mixture of fire and dark air, an ethereal and bright star that contains a much more remarkable element that is usual for those of earth, water, fire, and air. The moon is a solid earth-like celestial body. The argument of the above position is quite interesting and is based mainly on human observation. The speakers address issues related to the shadows seen on the faces shown on the moon, its motion in relation to the earth, its color, and its phases. A very important element that is touched upon in this piece, and that much later in modern history occupies scientists, is the fact that issues are astronomically directed related to the geography of space, as it's due to emphasize the interrelationship that exists between what happens on Earth and in the sky. It's interesting that with the establishment of a strong argument in favor of the position that the moon is like the Earth, the speakers try to approach the issue of whether the moon can be inhabited. This leads us to the second part of the dialogue, where the interlocutors explore a series of geographical issues concerning the environment, but also life itself on the Earth satellite. Teleological and environmental theories. This piece is almost monopolized by Lampria's monologue, which seems to agree with Plutarch's personal views on the subject, but also with Platonic philosophers. What the interlocutors are trying to resolve is not so much whether there really are beings on the moon, but whether they could live there. In another of his works, quote, On the Philosophers of Natural Dogmas, end quote, Plutarch states that the view that there are beings on the moon is attributed to the Pythagoreans, while Diogenes Laertius attributes it to Anaxagoras on the Philosophers, 89 Philosophers. Quote, The Pythagoreans claim that the moon seems to be earthly because it inhabits like our Earth, and on it there are animals larger in size and plants of exceptional beauty than those that can host our planet. They also do not leave feces behind, and there the days last 15 times longer. But the first approach to possibility of life on the moon is God, based on a teleological argument that had been made earlier, that the moon is like the Earth. It states, therefore, quote, If the existence of life on the moon is not possible, then it is absurd for the Earth to be the moon, because then it will appear that it was not made for any purpose but in vain, since it neither bears fruit nor offers people some kind of seat, birth, the ways of survival, things we say have happened here on Earth, end quote. Now, Theon's speech focuses on slandering in some way that there can be habitation on the moon, and puts forward a series of environmental barriers that make any form of life there impossible. Lamprias then takes the floor, disagreeing with the view that the moon has absolutely no role because humans alone cannot live on it. After all, it supports many places on Earth that are uninhabitable. Quote, First of all, then, it's not necessary people do not live on the moon, that it has been done in vain and without reason. Indeed, we do not see this land here producing or inhabiting it in its entirety, but a small part of it, as if it were peaks or peninsulas emerging from the seabed, is fertile in animals and plants, while from the rest it is desert and fruitless because of the bad weather and the heat, while most of them have sunk in the great sea. Never everything else, however, has been done in vain, because the sea produces gentle fumes and the most pleasant winds when summer is at its peak from the uninhabited and icy areas, release and scatter the snow as they slowly melt. In some way, a barren moon, from every trace of life, can still perform useful functions, such as absorbing the earth's fumes and mitigating the excessive heat and harshness of the sun. Lambrius goes on to say that nothing has been said to prove that habitation on the moon is unlikely, and argues in his monologue that it is inhabited by living beings, but who are higher in hierarchy than earthly mortals. Isn't that interesting? Its motion may not resemble that of the earth, but it is not irregular or unstable, as astronomers have proven otherwise. A similar balance brings calm to large temperature differences, while its delicate and transparent atmosphere diffuses sunlight, says Lamprius. He goes on to say that there are plants on Earth that can withstand extreme weather conditions and survive either with minimal water, drought, or snow, and yet adapt perfectly. At this point, Plutarch, through Lambria, lists a list of such plants on Earth and asks the following question to his interlocutors. Why are there no such plants on the moon that adapt to the conditions prevailing there? In a few words, quote, again, those who consider the moon a fiery and inflamed body are wrong, but even those who demand that the living creatures there have actually what organs they have there and for genesis, food, and survival seem to have no idea, from the anomalies related to nature, in which one can discover greater and more differences and dissimilarities of living creatures with each other than with non-living creatures, end quote. And Lambrius continues, after his observations about the environment and the people themselves who live on the moon, who may not need as much food as we on Earth to survive, thus respectively the moon's environment may be suitable for them in the same way that a seemingly inhospitable human ocean could support some form of life other than human life. The people of the moon, then. They would wander much more with the earth, seeing it like the dregs of mud of the universe, fading through the liquids, fogs, and clouds, a place without light, low and motionless, if it gives birth and feeds alive creatures which have a share in movement, respiration, and heat. It's very important the way in which Lambrius develops his argument, which is based on the pattern of the inverted perspective, putting in some way his interlocutors, but also his reader, in one outside the familiar human condition and position of observation. From this inverted perspective of beings living on the moon, where earthly beings are not the point of reference or observation, the moon itself is the real earth, quote unquote, occupying the middle position between the house of the gods and everything what is the underworld for them. Hence the gods at top, the moon earth in the middle, and the underworld at the end. This, in a way, warns its readers and interlocutors not to adopt and impose the earth's life model as that for norm or formula or view according to which they should perceive and predict life in the universe. We called it a different extraterrestrial perspective of the known human world, and it reveals diversity as a building block of life itself. According to Lambrius, the view that there can be no life on the moon may be due to the fact that human nature stands in the way of a man realizing that higher life forms than his own are likely to exist in the universe. At this point, the second part of the dialogue ends, but it would be unfair not to make some remark on the occasion of all the environmental knowledge presented by Plutarch about the diversity of areas on Earth, animals, and plants. Plutarch sounds like a warning to us that different environments may seem seemingly inhospitable to man, but from a non-teleological point of view, not everything has to have a complete or directly anthropocentric character purpose. For example, there is life in the oceans and deserts that in itself has its own value and character, although for humans is significant its significance may be seemingly distant. There are other writers in antiquity, such as Lucretius, who presents a series of examples which prove that even if there was a creator, then he certainly did not create everything for man, or we would supplement to suit and serve him, or even that earth was not created for man himself. The earth, he argues, is not perfect. Large areas of it are inaccessible to humans, and it's no secret that many of the animals that live on it adapt much more to nature than man does. Although life can be found even in the most inhospitable areas, Plutarch concludes in this piece that even these play a role in the functioning of everything. Highlighting these interactions within a geographical environment rejects the idea that the habitat perspective is what makes a place useful, whether it's the moon or the earth. We see then that Plutarch raises contemporary concerns us all, since the teleological view of the universe is still prominent in several schools of thought concerning the natural sciences, and especially those dealing with life. Especially the various ecosystems inevitably raise problems in terms of their operation and purpose. It remains to be debated whether or not a teleological view of the universe can be reduced by the mechanistic explanatory behavior of its individual parts, and whether a purely mechanistic explanation of the phenomena is possible. Plutarch, at least in his work, found it appropriate to point out that causation and cause are not synonymous, and that explaining an event by stating its causes does not eliminate the need for one to understand its significance. The role of the moon in Genesis creation. Perhaps the third part of the project is the one that is most interesting, at least here. At this point, Sulla first begins by telling a story he heard from a stranger living on Saturn Island, west of Britain. Beyond those islands, the story goes, there's a large continent where its rivers flow into the Atlantic Ocean. I guess here it's talking about North America. And from where there are sent to the island of Saturn, sent every 30 years when Saturn passes into the constellation of Taurus. This section, alone with the other details mentioned, is strongly reminiscent of the myth of Atlantis, recorded in Plato's Timaeus, and is what has preoccupied researchers the most. There are many similarities, but we will not worry more here, as we will focus on the second part of Sulla's story. So the stranger that Sulla meets in Carthage had discovered some sacred parchments that had been forgotten for a long time in the earth, and advised Sulla, quote, that of the visible gods people must honor the moon separately, which prompted me to do too, because she is a lady of life, she is near, end quote. Then briefly, we would say that Plutarch reformulates a fairly popular position for antiquity that the moon is the necessary intermediate station for the ascension of the soul to the higher realms. Let's briefly look at what Sulla's story says about the function of the moon, and then we'll proceed to the analysis of how the soul is imprisoned and it's placed in creation, or as the ancient texts refer to as its genesis. Moon and the journey of souls. And I'll deal with that in the second part of the video because this is very, very long. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Finally, support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.